March 27, 1945. The Shimonoseki Strait lay beneath a humid night sky, its waters unusually calm, reflecting only the flicker of lanterns aboard the merchant vessels that crept northward. Engines rumbled in steady rhythm, propellers churned, and the smell of oil and salt mingled with the damp air. To the Japanese officers in charge of this convoy, the strait was their shield, a narrow and familiar artery where minesweepers prowled daily, where the shallows and patrols seemed to bar enemy submarines from slipping in unseen. Men lit cigarettes and spoke quietly, convinced that the dangers of the wider Pacific had been left behind. Yet before dawn, their confidence was torn apart. The first explosion came without warning. A column of water and flame erupted beside a cargo vessel loaded with coal, throwing sailors across the deck. There had been no torpedo wake, no hum of engines beneath the surface, no clattering impact against a moored contact mine. The water had been still, and then it was fire. Shouts of disbelief rang out as officers scrambled for explanations. Some cried of ghosts beneath the waves. Others insisted an unseen submarine had fired blindly. But the escorts reported nothing on sonar. Patrol boats swept their searchlights, finding only smoke curling into the night. Moments later, a second blast hammered another ship. Steel plates crumpled, cargo spilled into the water, and a rising tide of panic spread through the column. Orders collided with rumor. Engines stalled as frightened captains demanded clarity. In the confusion, sailors remembered their training against submarines and air raids, but this invisible, silent strike fit neither. What the men could not yet grasp was that the danger had been born in the sky hours earlier, far beyond the horizon. At airfields on Okinawa and Tinian, American B-29 Superfortresses had lifted off, their bomb bays not filled with incendiaries or high explosives, but with squat, dark cylinders designed to float just beneath the surface. These aerial mines, nearly 2,000 pounds each, were equipped with magnetic, acoustic, and pressure triggers. Dropped from high altitude, they sank silently into the strait, waiting. The Japanese convoys had no countermeasure for such a weapon, and in March 1945, most of the naval command scarcely imagined that aircraft could mine waters with such precision. As more detonations rippled across the strait, disbelief gave way to dread. One after another, the convoy's vessels either struck mines or swerved into danger trying to avoid them. Flames spread along the decks, black smoke curled above the narrow waters, and the supposed lifeline of the empire was suddenly a corridor of wreckage. Witnesses later recalled hearing desperate cries in the dark, sailors clinging to wreckage as the tide carried them into burning slicks of oil. For the officers on the surviving ships, the realization was stark. The strait they trusted had betrayed them. By the following morning, word of the attack reached higher echelons of command. Reports struggled to explain the cause, speculating wildly about new Allied technologies. What became clear was more frightening than any rumor. If the Americans could mine the Shimonoseki Strait from the air, then no harbor, no port, no artery of supply across the home islands was safe. The arteries of the empire were tightening under an unseen fist, and Japan's naval leaders began to understand that the seas themselves had turned hostile. This night of burning ships would become the opening act in a broader campaign that the Allies named Operation Starvation, an effort to strangle Japan not with bombs alone, but with the slow, relentless suffocation of its shipping lanes. From the shock of March 1945, the story would widen to reveal how aerial mining became one of the least expected, yet most decisive weapons of the Pacific War. Late 1930s Japan stood astride an empire that stretched across East Asia and the Pacific. But at its core, it remained a nation with striking limitations. The home islands possessed skilled workers and expanding industry, but they lacked the very resources needed to keep that industry alive. Oil, the lifeblood of modern war, came not from Japan itself but from faraway fields in the Dutch East Indies. Rubber, vital for tires, seals, and countless war products, flowed from Malaya. Iron ore, bauxite, and coal arrived in heavy volumes from occupied regions of China and Korea. Every ton of ore that reached a blast furnace in Kobe, every gallon of crude refined at Yokohama, had crossed the sea in a merchant hull. The empire was tethered to its conquests by sea lanes, as dependent on them as lungs on oxygen. This dependence shaped every military decision. Unlike Germany, which could exploit land routes to some degree, Japan's factories, cities, and armies could not function without uninterrupted maritime transport. At the outbreak of war in 1941, the Japanese merchant marine was among the largest in the world, boasting over 6 million gross tons. Yet its size concealed fragility. These vessels were neither heavily armed nor numerous enough to sustain the massive demands of empire, once the Allies turned their attention to cutting the lines. Within months of Pearl Harbor, American submarines began prowling the vast Pacific, and by 1943, they had grown into a relentless predator force. The Japanese response was inadequate, a reflection of a doctrine forged in another age. Naval planners believed decisive battles would be fought between fleets of carriers and battleships. Echoing the victory at Tsushima in 1905, escorts, radar pickets, and organized convoy systems received scant investment. Anti-submarine warfare remained primitive, relying on depth charges and patrol craft with limited detection gear. When convoys did form, they were often poorly protected compared to their Allied counterparts. Merchant captains were left to trust in speed, camouflage, or good fortune. The result was attrition by stealth. Hundreds of thousands of tons of shipping lost each month, each freighter sunk, representing more factories starved of ore, more divisions short of supplies. By 1944, the submarine campaign had done more than bleed Japan's trade. It reshaped its shipping patterns. Long oceanic runs became deadly, forcing Tokyo to shift dependence toward coastal and inland routes. Narrow channels like the Shimonoseki Strait, the Inland Sea, and the Bungo Strait became arteries of survival. Here, Japanese leaders told themselves, submarines could not operate freely. Patrol boats prowled daily, minesweepers cleared the approaches, and shore-based aircraft stood ready. These waters were considered sanctuaries, where fuel and food could be ferried without fear. In time, this belief hardened into complacency. Captains assumed that convoys hugging the coast were safe, shielded by geography and constant watch. American planners, however, had studied the problem with cold clarity. They understood that Japan's war machine was not sustained by its aircraft carriers or its divisions in China, but by the anonymous ships carrying coal, rice, ore, and oil. Without them, the nation could not fight. Cutting these lifelines became priority. Submarine warfare had already proven the concept, but the losses inflicted beneath the open sea could be multiplied if the supposedly secure straits were closed as well. To do that, the United States sought a weapon not of direct battle but of silent denial. That weapon was the aerial mine. The idea was deceptively simple. Drop mines not from submarines or surface mine layers, but from aircraft capable of reaching inland waters once thought untouchable. In theory, it would transform the very geography of Japan into a trap, turning straits and harbors into fields of unseen peril. The mines would force ships to hesitate, to slow, to risk destruction in channels where there was no room to maneuver. The Americans called their effort Operation Starvation, and it aimed not at glory but at strangulation, cutting off a nation from the seas that fed it. Japan's great merchant fleet, once counted as a symbol of strength, was about to become its greatest liability. What had carried the empire's lifeblood would soon turn into a procession of targets. The sea lanes that sustained the empire in the late 1930s were, by 1945, prepared to betray it. The next step in the story turns from strategy to the machines themselves, the mines that would descend from the sky, silent and unseen, reshaping the war with every drop. March 1945 opened not with a thunder of guns, but with a silhouette against the moon. A B-29 Superfortress sliding over Japanese waters, its bomb bay loaded not with the high explosive loads of strategic bombing, but with blunt, squat cylinders fitted to fall and weight. These were aerial mines, steel housings roughly the length of a man, wrapped with parachutes to slow their descent, and designed to settle into harbor mouths, river mouths, and narrow straits without announcing themselves. Once in the water, they would bob, righted by flotation gear, and sink slowly to lie at a pre-programmed depth. Their telltale was not a visible wake or chain, but a silence that made the sea itself seem treacherous. The weapons came in a handful of standardized forms. There were approximately 2,000-pound class mines, often identified as the Mark 25, and smaller 1,000-pound variants such as the Mark 26-36. A single B-29 could carry several of the smaller or a handful of the larger mines, depending on internal modifications to the bomb bay. These weights mattered because they determined explosive charge, buoyancy equipment, and how a mine would behave while settling. In practical terms, a B-29 could be adapted to carry 7 of the 2,000-pound mines, or a dozen of the 1,000-pound types, transforming a heavy bomber into a mine layer capable of laying concentrated fields in narrow approaches. What made these devices more than dumb depth charges was their fusing, influence mechanisms that responded to the presence of ships rather than to contact. Engineers combined magnetic detectors that sensed a ship's hull, acoustic sensors tuned to propeller and machinery noise, and hydrostatic or pressure devices that measured the transient change in water pressure as a hull passed overhead. Some models included counter-count circuitry, timing or ship count mechanisms that deliberately allowed one or more vessels to pass before arming or detonating. Accrual logic meant to maximize disruption and sow uncertainty among sweepers, who expected mines to explode immediately on contact. Sensitivity settings could be varied and even randomized so that sweeping gear and grappling hooks proved unreliable against a minefield whose fuses did not behave predictably. The engineering extended beyond the mine itself into the delivery system. B-29s assigned to mine laying were fitted with release racks and parachute attachment points, and crews trained in radar approaches and specially timed releases so that a mine would enter the water at the correct depth and location. Radar guidance and trained approach profiles allowed crews to lay mines at night and in poor weather, reducing exposure to enemy fighters and flak while also increasing the element of surprise. The Marianas, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were essential to this calculus. From those bases, the B-29's long range made Japanese home waters reachable without intermediate staging, allowing the Army Air Forces to turn their strategic bombers into an airborne submarine force, able to reach harbors once thought beyond strike. For Japanese naval engineers and sweep crews, the effect was bewildering. Traditional countermeasures, mechanical sweep wires, paravanes, and the brute force of contact sweeping, assumed immediate, predictable responses from mines. Influence mines that armed after delay, that required acoustic signatures, or that would remain dormant until pressure conditions matched a large hull upended that calculus. Interrogations and post-action reports from late 1945 show repeated confusion over why cleared channels later yielded detonations or why ships struck mines months after presumed clearance. The Japanese had prepared for submarines and surface raiders. They had not prepared for the sky to become a stealth mine layer. The result of these technical choices was a weapon that turned geography into hazard. Where once narrow straits offered protection from open ocean predators, they now became traps in which maneuver was limited and the margin for error vanished. A single aerially delivered minefield could block a harbor for weeks, force tankers and freighters into longer, more vulnerable routes, and impose the very kind of logistical paralysis American strategists had calculated would cripple an island empire. The next chapter answers the question the engineers and planners had posed in testing rooms and briefing halls. How did these mines perform in action when dropped into Japan's own backyards? March 27, 1945. From the runways of Tinian, the roar of engines carried across the island night as more than 160 B-29 Superfortresses lifted into the dark. Each bomber carried not the incendiaries that had flattened Tokyo weeks earlier, but heavy steel cylinders fixed with parachutes and fuses. This was the opening blow of Operation Starvation, the first great experiment in aerial mining of Japanese waters. Their destination was the Shimonoseki Strait, the narrow throat that funneled nearly half of Japan's domestic trade between the inland sea and the Sea of Japan. The mission had been planned with precision. Crews of the 313th Bombardment Wing had trained for weeks in the new technique, calculating approach angles and release altitudes. Flying at heights between 5,000 and 15,000 feet, they dropped their cargo into patterns meant to seal the passage entirely. By dawn, more than 1,000 mines had slipped beneath the surface, spread across a strait only a few miles wide. To the Japanese commanders who woke that morning, nothing seemed changed. The strait still gleamed under the rising sun. No smoke rose, no bomb craters scarred the harbors. The attack was invisible, But the days that followed told a different story. On March 29th, a transport convoy entered the strait under escort. Sweepers had dragged the waters with their paravanes, declaring them clear. Confidence returned until a sharp concussion split the morning. A tanker buckled, flames racing across its deck. Sailors who had survived submarine torpedoes shouted in disbelief. The sweepers had promised safety. Panic rippled through the column as another vessel struck, then another. Ships scattered in the narrow waters, their evasive maneuvers only leading some into freshly laid fields. For the men aboard, the psychological toll was devastating. Traditional threats could be fought, submarines hunted, planes engaged, surface raiders shelled. But these minds were unseen, silent, waiting. Reports describe sailors whispering of phantoms in the water, captains pleading with escorts for assurance they could not give. Assurance of safe passage, once guaranteed by routine sweeping, collapsed. Every declared channel might conceal waiting death. Within a week, Japanese records listed a grim roster. Tankers vital for fuel, transports carrying food, even smaller naval auxiliaries ripped open by explosions that came without warning. Losses were not measured only in tonnage, but in paralysis. Convoys halted, delayed, or rerouted. Coastal shipping slowed to a crawl. For an economy already strangled by submarine warfare, the sudden closure of its most vital artery was catastrophic. In Tokyo, naval staff received the first reports with disbelief. For years they had prepared for American bombing raids on cities and factories. But the idea that the enemy could weaponize the sea itself, sowing invisible traps from aircraft, seemed impossible. Engineers were dispatched to investigate, but even as they studied fragments of recovered mines, new detonations claimed more ships. The leadership realized with dawning horror that they had no quick counter. Minesweepers could not keep pace. Delays and due periods only deepened confusion. The opening at Shimonoseki proved the concept beyond doubt. The air-delivered mine had transformed a vital lifeline into a gauntlet of fear. Japanese high command, stunned and scrambling for answers, now faced a new kind of war, one that no fleet action could resolve. And as the first convoys faltered in March 1945, the Americans prepared to expand the campaign, turning more harbors and straits into deadly traps. The next stage of the story shifts from shock to reaction. How Japan's leaders and engineers struggled to comprehend and counter this invisible assault. April 1945 brought no relief to the Japanese Naval Command. The reports arriving from the Shimonoseki Strait and other coastal routes read like dispatches from another kind of war, one fought against an enemy that could not be seen. Merchant captains described explosions that came days after a channel had been swept and certified safe. Tanker losses mounted. Rumors spread among crews that the mines could move, even that they could hunt ships, a superstition born from the randomness of detonations. What unsettled sailors most was not only the destruction, but the uncertainty. They no longer knew what safe water meant. The Naval General Staff demanded answers. Orders went out to recover unexploded devices at any cost. Divers were dispatched into dangerous currents, crawling along seabeds where the mines lay half-buried. It was desperate, perilous work. Some never returned. Yet fragments and occasionally intact weapons were hauled to shore and examined under secrecy. The findings stunned engineers. These were not moored contact mines, chained to anchors in predictable grids. They were influence mines, activated by the very presence of a ship's hull. Inside, Japanese analysts found complex mechanisms, magnetic coils sensitive to steel, acoustic triggers that responded to propeller signatures, and pressure switches that measured the displacement of passing hulls. Some even bore counters that allowed vessels to pass before activating, a deliberate cruelty designed to destroy confidence in sweeping. The revelations were deeply unsettling. Axis ally Germany had employed influence mines earlier in the war, and Japanese officers knew of them in theory. But they had assumed such weapons were delivered by submarines or surface mine layers, not scattered by the hundreds from high-flying bombers. In disbelief, intelligence officers submitted memos to the Imperial General Staff, noting the scale of American effort. Could the United States truly have produced thousands of such devices and delivered them in patterns dense enough to close the Empire's most vital straits in a matter of nights? Many could not reconcile the evidence with their long-held assumptions about American capacity. Tokyo had underestimated not only American technology, but also the sheer industrial weight behind it. The practical response was hurried and improvisational. Mine-clearing units were expanded, fitted with magnetic cables to drag across channels, hoping to trigger detonations at a safe distance. Others tried towing noise-making sleds to fool acoustic fuses, or increasing convoy speeds to pass before pressure mines could arm. But the adaptations lagged behind reality. Mines with time delays and counters made sweeping unpredictable. Channels declared open one day could erupt the next. Each failure deepened the sense of futility. At sea, morale collapsed. Merchant captains petitioned to delay or reroute voyages, pleading that their crews were unwilling to enter the straits. Officers reported panic spreading when even a harmless floating barrel was sighted. Shipping schedules fell into chaos. Every delayed freighter meant coal arriving late, rice spoiled, factories waiting idle. Sailors accustomed to facing submarines or aircraft now spoke in dread of the silent weapons they could neither see nor fight. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, the consequences were severe. Already pressed thin by defending the home islands against bomber raids, by escorting dwindling convoys and by conserving fuel, they were now forced to divert scarce men and resources into an ever-growing campaign of mine clearance. Patrol boats were reassigned, escort destroyers reallocated, mine-sweeping divisions expanded hastily. Each diversion weakened the fleet's ability to meet other threats. Japan's naval leaders found themselves in a trap of their own. The more they tried to contain the mining campaign, the more vulnerable they became elsewhere. In the spring of 1945, frustration hardened into recognition. The enemy had found a way to weaponize the sea, forcing Japan to exhaust itself in endless defensive effort. And as Tokyo poured men into clearing operations, across the Pacific, the United States was already preparing to escalate, scaling mine production, refining tactics, and broadening the scope of Operation Starvation. By the time the first mines sank into the Shimonoseki Strait in late March 1945, their presence testified to more than technical ingenuity. It revealed the scale of an industrial machine that could sustain such a campaign without pause. Across the United States, factories that had once produced automobiles, farm equipment, and commercial machinery had long since turned to war production. Detroit, already famed as the arsenal of democracy, rolled out tanks, aircraft engines, and trucks in relentless quantities. Now its assembly lines were tasked with something far more specialized: aerial mines by the thousands. Presses stamped steel casings, chemical plants filled explosive charges, and electronics firms wired the sensitive fuses that made these weapons so unpredictable. By late 1944, output ran into thousands per month, enough not only to arm the submarines and mine layers of the fleet, but to supply an entirely new air-delivered campaign. The numbers spoke to America's wartime asymmetry. Japan was losing merchant ships faster than its shipyards could replace them. By 1944, production had slowed to a trickle under fuel shortages and air raids. Meanwhile, the United States could build, ship, and stockpile mines at a pace that made their deployment seem inexhaustible. A single mission could consume hundreds of devices, yet reserves were deep enough that planners did not hesitate to schedule repeated strikes. Where Japan viewed each merchant vessel as irreplaceable, America could treat each mine as expendable. Getting those mines from Midwest factories to Japanese waters required a logistical ballet of its own. Mines were transported by rail to West Coast ports, shipped across the Pacific in cargo holds, and unloaded at bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. There, in camouflaged storage depots, they were kept under guard until needed. Crews of the 313th Bombardment Wing and others learned to assemble parachutes, arm fuses, and load the cumbersome weapons into the bomb bays of their B-29s. Ground crews operated with speed and secrecy. Even among other units on the islands, little was said of the new mission. What Japanese intelligence intercepted were references to bombing campaigns, fire raids, and fuel shortages, not the quiet stockpiling of thousands of mines. The tactical side required equal preparation. B-29 crews trained not for dramatic daylight raids, but for precision night operations guided by radar. Using the ANAPQ-13 radar set, navigators could plot coastlines, rivers, and channels invisible in darkness. Release points were calculated so that mines would fall in deliberate patterns, staggered grids across straits, nets across harbor mouths, or dense fields in approach channels. It was a discipline closer to engineering than to bombing, requiring accuracy without the visual cues of daylight. By spring 1945, entire wings of B-29s could sortie with nothing but mines aboard, laying more than 1,500 weapons in a single night. This integration of industrial supply and tactical application was not accidental. Major General Curtis LeMay, commanding 21 Bomber Command, saw mining not as an alternative to incendiary raids, but as a complement. While firebombing struck Japan's cities and industries, mining severed the arteries that fed them. In April 1945, incendiary raids blackened the skies above Osaka and Tokyo, while mines slipped unseen into the waters below. For Japan, there was no reprieve. Its towns burned by day, its convoys shattered by night. The results underscored the imbalance. Japan strained to man minesweeping divisions, drafting fishermen and requisitioning small craft, yet every cleared channel risked reseeding the next evening. Each mine cost the United States a few $100s in steel, explosives, and electronics. Each ship lost cost Japan thousands of tons of irreplaceable cargo and weeks of production. It was war measured not only in battles, but in output, where America's factories dictated the tempo. By the summer of 1945, Operation Starvation had become the visible proof of America's ability to choke an empire both above and below the waterline. Fire destroyed Japan's cities, submarines prowled the open ocean, and mines made its inner seas treacherous. The empire's greatest advantage, its maritime reach, was now a liability. Its sea lanes poisoned by weapons borne from assembly lines an ocean away. The stage was set for further demonstrations of battlefield effectiveness, as straits, harbors, and even inland passages turned into minefields that no Japanese commander could ignore. April 1945 marked the beginning of the broad net. The first shock at Shimonoseki had proven the concept, but American commanders knew that a single strait was not enough. With mines flowing steadily from U.S. factories and entire wings of B-29s now trained for night sowing, the campaign widened. On the nights of April 3rd and 4th, superfortresses swept toward the harbors of Kobe and Osaka, cities already battered by incendiary raids, yet still functioning as maritime lifelines. Instead of firebombs, parachutes opened beneath their bomb bays, and steel cylinders drifted silently into the water approaches. By dawn, mines lay waiting in channels that carried coal from Kyushu, rice from Formosa, and oil from what remained of southern holdings. Nagoya soon followed. The great industrial port that fed aircraft plants and machine works depended on convoys threading narrow access points. In late April, B-29s seeded those channels too. By the end of the month, aerial mining had spread from the inland sea outward across Japan's eastern and western seaboards. Harbors once considered too shallow or too enclosed for conventional attack were now as vulnerable as any open strait. To American planners, the sea itself had become another battlefield grid, mapped and targeted with the same rigor as city streets. The results accumulated with brutal arithmetic. Between April and July 1945, more than 12,000 mines were dropped into Japanese waters. Navy assessments later tallied over 600 vessels sunk or damaged, ranging from small coasters and tankers to naval auxiliaries. Japanese records confirm the sudden paralysis. Harbors clogged with ships listing in the shallows, hulls gashed beneath the waterline, their cargoes spoiled or burning. Crews returned to shore shaken, some refusing to re-embark until channels were declared safe. But safe had become an illusion. Mines with delayed fuses, counters, and influence triggers ensured that no clearance lasted long. Eyewitness accounts spoke of eerie silences in once bustling ports. At Kobe, captains reported rows of freighters idling at anchor, waiting for clearance that never came. In the inland sea, where thousands of small craft had once ferried coal, grain, and timber, the waterways became deserted. Fishermen were conscripted into sweeping crews, but their nets and grapples brought up few mines, and every detonation reinforced the futility of their labor. The very sound of an explosion offshore, once rare, became common enough that it no longer surprised the civilians who lived along the coasts. The economic impact deepened daily. Coal shipments from Kyushu dwindled, starving factories in Osaka and Tokyo of power. Rice convoys from Formosa were disrupted, worsening shortages already straining a hungry civilian population. Oil tankers from the south were so frequently sunk or delayed that military planners began to hoard reserves for the defense of the home islands, leaving aircraft grounded and warships idle. By July, Japanese staff officers admitted in their reports that coastal shipping had virtually ceased. The inland sea, once the beating heart of domestic trade, had become a graveyard of wrecks and hesitation. For sailors and civilians alike, the mines became a symbol of helplessness. Unlike bombers, which could be seen and fought with flak or fighters, these weapons lay beneath the water, invisible and patient. Officers recorded the atmosphere of dread, crews whispering that the sea itself had turned against them. The collapse was not only material but psychological. Ports where once there had been the clang of cranes and the shouts of stevedores now lay silent, their stillness broken only by the occasional muffled thunder of another ship torn apart. By midsummer 1945, Japan's supply chain was unraveling. Submarines had already strangled the long ocean routes, but now aerial mines had closed the final arteries nearest home. For the Empire, survival itself had become uncertain, as every voyage risked destruction and every harbor promised entrapment. And as the ships fell silent, so too did the voices of those who once believed the seas were their shield. What followed was the deeper consequence, the way fear, futility, and inevitability reshaped the minds of sailors, officers, and civilians alike. By the summer of 1945, the sea itself had become a place of dread for Japanese sailors. Every voyage was a wager, not just against submarines or bombers, but against the unseen. Survivors recalled the sleepless nights at sea, straining their ears for the hollow, splitting thud that meant steel had been torn open beneath them. Mines detonated without warning, sometimes weeks after they were sown, sometimes in channels already declared safe by sweeping crews. That uncertainty gnawed at men who had once trusted in discipline and routine. Even the act of reaching port brought no relief. Sailors knew the mines could remain waiting, patient and invisible, for the next hull. Reports filtered back to Tokyo describing crews who refused to sail. Men who deserted their posts rather than face what they called the silent enemy. It was an extraordinary breakdown in discipline for a navy long celebrated for its obedience. Merchant captains pressed into service to keep coal and rice flowing, petitioned for delays, or begged to reroute voyages entirely. Some convoys sat idle for days, while officers argued over whether the waters ahead were survivable. This paralysis spoke to something greater than physical danger. It was the corrosion of faith that the Imperial Navy could shield its people. The civilian population saw the evidence daily. Burned or shattered hulks drifted into the harbors of Kobe, Osaka, and Nagoya, their twisted frames a constant reminder that no channel was secure. Black smoke on the horizon no longer meant a distant air raid, but the destruction of yet another freighter struck down in waters once thought inviolate. Families of sailors gathered at quaysides with dread, not knowing whether their husbands or sons would return. The war had brought fire from the sky and hunger from shortages. Now it brought despair from the sea. On the Allied side, the effect was the inverse. Bomber crews who had once questioned the worth of long, dangerous missions across the Pacific now saw tangible results. Unlike incendiary raids, which demanded flying through heavy flak and fighters, mining operations often went unopposed. Each mission meant fewer Japanese ships at sea, fewer supplies moving north, and fewer warplanes fueled or fed. Men who had once doubted their contribution came home with confidence, knowing they had paralyzed an enemy without losing comrades to anti-aircraft fire. Submarine commanders, too, welcomed the aerial campaign. For years they had borne the main burden of strangling Japanese supply lines, but mines tightened the noose further. Commanders noted with satisfaction that aerial mining drove Japanese convoys into fewer, riskier routes, making them easier prey. One officer later remarked that the B-29s mined them out of hiding, forcing ships into waters where submarines could finish the work. It was a partnership of silence, underwater and from the sky, that trapped Japan in a tightening cage. The psychological effect reached beyond simple morale. For Japan, fear itself became a weapon wielded by the Allies. Each voyage demanded not only courage, but resignation to fate. Each delay starved industries and deepened the sense that the empire was cornered. By July 1945, Japanese leaders admitted privately that the nation was not merely besieged, it was haunted. The unseen presence beneath every wave had broken confidence in the sea as a lifeline. Fear had become a force multiplier. Mines that never detonated still achieved victory, holding back convoys, immobilizing harbors and paralyzing entire sectors of trade. The Allies had weaponized uncertainty, and in the minds of Japan's sailors and citizens, the water itself had turned hostile. This fear would carry consequences beyond the individual voyage, shaping strategic decisions at the highest levels of command. And it is there in the councils of Tokyo and Washington that the story turns next, to how the psychological war at sea translated into choices that defined the closing months of the conflict. By the summer of 1945, Operation Starvation had tightened its grip on Japan with a force as decisive as any battle fleet. The results were measurable not only in ships sunk, but in the steady unraveling of an island empire that could no longer feed or fuel itself. From April to July, B-29s laid minefields in every crucial artery: Shimonoseki, the inland sea, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, and the cumulative effect was suffocating. By July, intelligence estimated that 90% of merchant traffic through the Shimonoseki Strait had ceased entirely. What had once been the most vital maritime highway of the nation now lay abandoned, stalked by invisible weapons that no sweeping effort could defeat. The losses mounted with crushing inevitability. Tankers that once carried fuel from Formosa and the Dutch East Indies no longer reached the refineries of Yokohama or Kobe. Coal shipments from Kyushu dwindled to a trickle, starving the furnaces of Osaka and Nagoya. Factories slowed or fell silent, power stations imposed rolling blackouts, and entire industrial sectors began grinding to a halt. Rice shipments, already reduced by submarine losses, became sporadic. Civilians lined up for dwindling rations, the once familiar bowls of white rice now replaced with thin mixtures, bulked out by millet or barley. In a nation where morale was tightly bound to food and fuel, the blockade's silent hand was everywhere felt. For the Imperial Navy, the consequences were dire. Fuel shortages already kept its capital ships idle in anchorages. Now even the few escorts still available could not protect convoys that dared to move. Mines forced convoys into narrow routes, and every loss deepened the shortage of hulls. In Tokyo, naval staff struggled with impossible mathematics. Too few ships, too little fuel, too many demands. The navy that had once sailed across the Pacific in pursuit of empire now lacked the resources to guard even its own coast. American planners saw in these statistics the validation of a strategy. Operation Starvation, conceived as a complement to incendiary raids, proved in practice to be devastating in its own right. While the firebombing of Tokyo in March had killed over 100,000 people in a single night, the mining campaign required far fewer sorties, cost far fewer American lives, and yet strangled Japan's logistics just as effectively. Submarine commanders, bomber wings, and naval analysts alike agreed that the aerial mining effort had paralyzed Japanese shipping more completely than surface raiders or traditional blockades could ever have achieved. For the crews who flew the missions, the comparison was stark. Unlike high-altitude raids over heavily defended cities, mining sorties were often conducted at night, under radar guidance and with minimal losses. Each B-29 sortie dropped a handful of mines, but in aggregate, they created effects disproportionate to the risk. The cost-benefit equation favored the Americans overwhelmingly. A few tons of steel and explosives could idle entire convoys and starve whole cities. Japanese commanders, though slow to admit it publicly, recognized the enormity of the blow. Internal reports in July 1945 acknowledged that the blockade of shipping had reached catastrophic levels. One admiral noted bitterly that our war effort has been cut to the bone not by fleet action, but by mines. Another commented that the home islands are now surrounded by silent walls. It was an admission that Japan, already reeling under fire and famine, now faced strangulation. Yet for all its success, Operation Starvation was not flawless. Mines occasionally failed to arm, or currents carried them off course. Weather complicated drops, and some minefields required reseeding to maintain effectiveness. American planners adapted quickly, refining patterns, improving fuses, and adjusting radar release techniques. These refinements ensured the blockade tightened rather than weakened as weeks passed. By midsummer 1945, Japan was caught in a trap of fire above and steel below, starved by the skies as much as by submarines. Operation Starvation had proven that a campaign waged with far less bloodshed could still cripple an enemy. It was a demonstration of how technology, planning, and industry could combine to collapse an empire without a decisive fleet battle. And yet, even as the blockade choked Japan, American commanders knew the campaign's limits and continued to adapt, preparing for the final blows that would decide the war. No campaign, however ingenious, was without its flaws. The aerial mining of Japan's waters revealed its own limitations almost as soon as it began. Mines, for all their clever engineering, were subject to the whims of nature. Currents could drag them off course, depositing them in deeper channels or sweeping them into mud, where they failed to detonate. Storms scattered carefully laid patterns, leaving gaps in minefields that convoys occasionally exploited. In some cases, fuses failed to arm after water entry, or devices triggered prematurely, wasting their effect. American aircrews returning from missions sometimes learned that only a fraction of the mines dropped had achieved their intended placement. Japanese sweepers, too, were not entirely helpless. Desperation spurred innovation. Using magnetic cables and makeshift acoustic noise generators, they cleared channels at the cost of ships and men. Sweepers recorded moments of triumph when routes once closed were reopened, even if only briefly. Each success carried a price, however: lives lost to detonations, and hours or days spent dragging channels that were reseeded within nights. For the men involved, sweeping became a form of combat as dangerous as any naval battle. American crews adapted swiftly. Radar-guided approaches became more precise, reducing scatter and ensuring minefields overlapped in deadly density. Drop patterns were adjusted to account for prevailing currents, with staggered releases across broader areas to compensate for drift. Just as important was the deliberate mixing of mine types. Pressure mines triggered by displacement were laid alongside acoustic devices tuned to propeller signatures, and magnetic fuses designed to sense steel hulls. The combination ensured that no single sweeping method could clear a channel. Even when sweepers removed one type, another remained, sowing fresh uncertainty. Logistics presented another challenge. Each mining sortie tied up B-29s that might otherwise have carried incendiaries to Japan's cities. Within Gyeonggi Bomber Command, debates flared over whether the payoff justified the diversion. Some officers argued that the incendiary campaign inflicted immediate and measurable damage on urban centers, while mining demanded patience, its effects accumulating slowly. Yet as results mounted, ships lost, ports idle, industries starved, the skeptics fell silent. The tonnage statistics spoke louder than theory. A single mine could idle more shipping than a dozen bombs dropped on a factory. The strain was real, though. Ground crews had to prepare parachutes, arm fuses, and handle delicate components under tight schedules. Storage depots on the Marianas brimmed with mines awaiting missions, and every sortie required precise coordination. B-29 crews, trained originally for high-altitude bombing, had to relearn techniques for low to mid-altitude night drops guided by radar alone. Mistakes meant wasted mines, or worse, the loss of accuracy that gave the campaign its edge. Yet despite these limitations, the campaign's success was undeniable. Japanese shipping fell to a trickle, harbors grew silent, and industries faltered. The imperfections mattered little when set against the sheer scale of results. The mines did not need to be flawless. They only needed to be persistent. Each gap left by drift was reseeded, each failure offset by dozens of successful detonations. By July 1945, Operation Starvation had earned recognition as one of the most effective uses of American air power, not because it was perfect, but because it was relentless. The story of aerial mining was one of adaptation as much as innovation. Flaws forced improvements, enemy resistance prompted refinements, and logistical strains were overcome by sheer capacity. In the end, what mattered was not whether every mine worked, but that enough did to strangle an empire. That lesson, of persistence, innovation, and industrial weight, would leave a legacy reaching far beyond the final months of the Pacific War, shaping how navies and air forces conceived the control of seas in the generations to come. August 1945 brought silence to the seas as Japan capitulated, but when Allied survey teams entered the harbors and straits of the defeated empire, the true scale of the aerial mining campaign became visible. Rusted hulks leaned against piers at Kobe and Osaka. Tankers lay split in shallow waters, their bows pointing skyward, half-submerged reminders of voyages never completed. Survey reports estimated that more than 670 vessels had been sunk or permanently disabled by aerial mines, and over 1,200 more had been forced to delay, reroute, or abandon their missions. What Japanese sailors had whispered in dread during the final months was confirmed in cold statistics. The minefields had effectively paralyzed maritime movement at the moment when Japan most desperately needed fuel, food, and material to fight on. In interviews conducted by Allied occupation officials, Japanese naval leaders conceded what they had not dared to admit publicly. The minefields around the Shimonoseki Strait, Nagoya, and the inland sea had closed their arteries of trade almost completely. Mines had succeeded where fleets could not, enforcing a blockade that starved the empire, without requiring the massive loss of life that might have come from direct amphibious invasion. One admiral remarked with bitterness that our cities burned from above, but our nation died from below. The legacy of Operation Starvation did not end with Japan's surrender. Strategists in Washington and London immediately recognized the implications for future wars. Here was proof that air-delivered mines, deployed at relatively low cost and risk, could paralyze an enemy dependent on sea transport. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the United States once again turned to aerial mining. The ports of Wonsan and Hungnam were sealed for weeks, delaying communist supply efforts in ways reminiscent of 1945. In Vietnam, 2 decades later, Operation Pocket Money closed Haiphong Harbor with similar methods, echoing the lessons first tested over Japan. Beyond the United States, foreign navies took note. The Soviet Union in particular studied the American campaign closely, incorporating the concept of airdropped mines into its Cold War doctrine of sea denial. By the 1950s, NATO and Warsaw Pact planners alike recognized that aircraft could lay minefields across straits and choke points faster than any surface vessel. From the Baltic to the South China Sea, the shadow of Operation Starvation shaped calculations of maritime vulnerability. It was not only a weapon, but a strategic idea that control of the sea could be challenged from the air, invisibly and relentlessly. Yet even as doctrine evolved, the mines themselves lingered in Japan's waters, a darker legacy of endurance. Thousands of Japanese civilians and sailors continued to perish after the war, their ships striking mines that had lain dormant for months or even years. Fishing boats, coastal traders, and repatriation convoys fell victim to explosions long after the guns fell silent. Minesweeping became a massive post-war undertaking, involving not only Allied navies, but also Japanese crews pressed into hazardous work. Casualties mounted, a grim reminder that the weapon's effect outlasted the war it had been designed to end. The endurance of fear also lingered. For those who lived near the inland sea, the sound of an unexpected detonation in 1946 or 1947 could bring back the terror of the final year of war. The wrecks remained visible well into the 1950s, ghostly monuments to a campaign that had starved a nation without ever firing a shot in anger. Thus, the post-war legacy of aerial mining was twofold, as a strategic innovation that reshaped naval doctrine across the globe, and as a haunting weapon whose effects continued to claim lives long after surrender. In the minds of planners, it stood as one of the most cost-effective campaigns of the war. In the memories of survivors, it remained a symbol of how the sea itself had betrayed them. From Tokyo Bay to Korea, from Vietnam to Cold War strategy, rooms in Moscow and Washington, the lesson endured. The weapon from the sky could silence the ports of any nation. And with that legacy, the story circles back to 1945, to the stunned disbelief of Japanese sailors who first realized that even in their home waters, there was no safety left. March 1945. The night sky over the Shimonoseki Strait glowed red as ships burned, their flames reflected in the black water. Japanese officers stared into the chaos with disbelief, unable to explain how a convoy that had passed sweeping crews and patrol boats could now be torn apart from beneath. The seas had always been Japan's arteries of strength, routes of rice, oil, coal, and ore, but on that night they became traps. It was here, in those narrow channels, that commanders first grasped they were fighting an enemy that could not be seen. The aerial mine was not glamorous. It did not roar like a battleship's guns, or sweep the sky like carrier planes. It was silent steel, drifting down on parachutes and waiting in darkness. Yet in its simplicity lay power. It broke morale as surely as it broke hulls. It imposed hesitation where once there had been certainty, and it forced a nation built on maritime lifelines to live in fear of its own waters. By July 1945, this quiet siege had starved industries, darkened cities, and left harbors clogged with idle or shattered ships. For the Americans, the campaign was a vindication of ingenuity and scale. Operation Starvation proved that victory did not always require direct clashes or costly assaults. Technological imagination, coupled with the capacity to produce thousands of weapons and deliver them night after night, achieved what fleets alone could not. The B-29s that sowed those mines became an invisible navy, enforcing a blockade more decisive than any surface action. The lesson was stark. Wars are not always decided by the loudest explosions or the most spectacular raids. Sometimes they are won by what cannot be heard, the unseen pressure that strangles an enemy until movement ceases. In the final months of the Pacific War, the minefields were more than weapons. They were symbols of inevitability, proof that Japan's empire could no longer feed itself, fuel itself, or fight on. As the war closed, the images remained. Empty harbors where cranes stood idle, silent seas once crowded with convoys, and commanders hunched over maps where lifelines had been erased by invisible fields. The siege had been silent, but its result was absolute. From the burning strait at Shimonoseki to the surrendered ships in Tokyo Bay, the end had come not only from fire raining down from the sky, but from steel that waited patiently below.